Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. I'm happy to welcome all of you to this new session of the Rafael del Pino Foundation's Keynote Lecture Program. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon in the auditorium, and greetings also to those who are following us via our digital platform and social media. In an international context which is marked by profound political, economic, and technological transformations, it is especially appropriate to stop and think serenely, with historical perspective, on the conditions that have allowed civilizations to flourish and on the reasons that explain, on occasion, their decline. Under the title, Peak Human, What We Can Learn from the Rise and Fall of Golden Ages, we are here today with Johan Norberg, whom this institution is pleased to consider a friend. Johan is a Swedish author, lecturer, and documentary filmmaker with a bachelor's and master's degree in the history of ideas from Stockholm University and a senior fellow at the Cato Institute in Washington. He is one of the most internationally recognized voices in the analysis of economic development, freedom, and human progress. His works, translated into more than 30 languages, have been recognized by publications such as the FT and The Economist. In addition, he has produced and presented documentaries for United States public television, and he has received numerous international awards for his contribution to public debate. He is visiting us today for the fourth time, which is a source of particular pleasure for the Foundation. He was with us in 2018 for the publication of his work Progress, in 2021, Open, and in 2024, The Capitalist Manifesto. His return now with a new work is undoubtedly excellent news. At the Foundation, we like to say, half-jokingly, that when an author returns so many times, it is because the conversations here are never-ending. This afternoon's lecture is being held to mark the publication of his latest book, Peak Human. We need to think critically, as all democracies call for. And this afternoon, we are marking the publication of his latest work, as I said before, Peak Human, and What Can We Learn, published by Deusto. In this work, Johan Norberg analyzes 7 great golden ages, from the classical Athens to the modern Anglosphere, to identify the institutional, cultural, and economic factors that allowed for extraordinary periods of creativity, prosperity, and innovation, as well as the reasons that explain their subsequent decline. This book asks us to ask an essential question: what conditions allow a civilization to flourish? What decisions may jeopardize that dynamism? This is an issue that undoubtedly also challenges us today. After the keynote speech, we will see a dialogue with Professor Francisco Beltrán, Director of REMCO, a PhD in political science and professor at a number of Spanish and international universities, with a solid track record in institutional analysis and comparative politics, who will help us explore the ideas raised. Thank you so much, Paco. I remind you that you can ask your questions via the QR code, which you received upon entering. And without further ado, I invite you to join us in this reflection. Let's think about the lessons offered by the history of great civilizations. I'm happy to give the floor to Johan Norberg. Thank you so much.
I've been here so many times, but I always want to make an entrance on this stage. Thank you, Maria. Thank you to the Foundation. It is a pleasure to be back again. Yes, you get back when the conversation is good, when the climate is nice, and the intellectual climate is stimulating. So that's a very good reason to be back. Thank you so much for inviting me again. And thank you also to Deusto and Grupo Planeta for publishing my book. I'm delighted to see it published in Spanish, not just because it is a great readership audience. My Spanish readers are some of the best readers I know. Also because it has a new title, because the old title, when it came in English, was Peak Human. And every single person who heard about that title thought that it was a book about exercise and how to stay in shape, how to get those miles and do the exercise and sleep well, and so on. And I will never forget when a colleague of my editor said that if they do think it is about exercise, it'll sell better than if they know it's about history. So we stuck to that title, but I think the Spanish one is probably more accurate. On the other hand, it is a book about how to stay in shape, but not as an individual, but as a society and a culture. How to make sure that you stay creative, how you stay dynamic, how you stay being innovative and growing. Because that is a challenge. Just like human beings need some exercise to stay in shape, we can never stop, because if we do, we will lag behind. It's the same thing with cultures and civilizations. We can never get too comfortable. We constantly have to renew the engines of innovation and of progress. So that's why I wrote this book about golden ages, about moments in history when societies managed to build success, growth and innovation, and what made that possible. So the question then obviously is, what is a golden age? What do I mean when I talk about great cultures? I'm not thinking about big empires as such. I'm not referring to territorial expansion, because in that case, Russia, when they're trying to invade their neighbors, might seem like a great civilization. Well, it's not if it doesn't create golden conditions for people in those societies. So what I'm thinking about is something else, what we're all trying to strive for today. How we can create cultural creativity, scientific curiosity, technological innovation, and economic growth. Golden ages are episodes in history when we had a large number of innovations in different spheres and sectors at the same time, thereby creating better living standards and opportunities for most people who lived there. Not for everybody. And that we have to remind ourselves of that always when we talk about history. The conditions for most people throughout history has been one of poverty and of oppression, and that goes even for the best societies in history. Mary Beard, the classicist who's an expert on the Roman Empire, she often finds that when she talks to an audience, there are so many people who envy the Roman Empire. They would have wanted to live there. Wouldn't that have been magnificent? Then she realizes that they all think that they would have been senators in Rome, or even emperors in Rome, which are a few hundred people in that civilization. Much more likely, unfortunately, that they would have been destitute, farmers, or even slaves in somebody's household or a mine. So we have to remember that most civilizations throughout history have engaged in slavery, territorial conquest, and they've given women few, if any, rights. However, we can't be too relativistic about it, because that's not what the neighbors saw when they looked to Rome or to Athens. It's not that they saw, oh, they have a lot of oppression over there and slavery, because they had that back home as well. Everybody did back in those days. What set Rome apart and what the neighbors realized was that for a brief moment in time, they managed to lift more people out of that and giving them more opportunities and more prosperity. And that's the key. Why did that happen? And to try to find out, let me give you a brief tour around the world about these 7 cultures that I'm looking at in this book, to get a sense of what we're looking for. So let's start in Athens, almost 2,500 years ago. The small but powerful Greek city-state that gave us concepts of philosophy and of democracy. And I would argue the very idea of intellectual innovation, because there had been innovative societies before. We've had in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, the Phoenician merchants, they were all very innovative, but to get some legitimacy for their ideas, for their novel ideas, technologies, and business models, they always had to pretend that this was an old idea. That was how you made ideas succeed. You said that this is something that our ancestors knew about, and then we forgot about it, but now we're back. However, the Athenians were the first to say that it's okay, it's acceptable, it's even virtuous to look at the world in a new way, to see something new, to find the patterns of nature or of humans, and to talk about it and to explain your discoveries to others. So when Aristotle talked about his teacher, Plato, and said that we have to celebrate and cherish our teachers and friends, but also the truth. The truth is also important. And if they are in conflict, we have to choose truth. That was a novel moment in intellectual history, because that's the first time it's legitimate. It's okay to say that the ancestors were wrong, and even the teachers are wrong, because I've seen something else over here. And when that spirit pervades a culture, then you will see extraordinary things happening in other places as well. In sculpture, in architecture, shipbuilding, in creating drama, which they did for the first time in Athens, and possibly, most importantly, they created the science of history, without which we couldn't learn from history, with Herodotus and Thucydides. So that's why I start with Athens. The second culture that I write about is one that learned a lot from Athens, and that's Rome, the Roman Republic, and the early Roman Empire. In the centuries before Christ and a few afterwards, which is quite extraordinary. Have you been thinking about Rome today? Hands up, anyone? Do you know this meme on TikTok and social media? Apparently, especially men think about Rome all the time. And there was one guy, he's a Roman reenactor dressing up as a legionnaire. He said that ask your husband or your boyfriend or your brother how often he thinks about Rome. You will be surprised. And they were, and lots of people, they filmed the reactions about it. Some people said that, oh, I think about it some 4 or 5 times a day. There's so much to think about. I actually talked to this guy, Gaius Flavius, the Roman reenactor, and asked him, so how often do you think about Rome? And he said, only once. But it begins when I wake up and it ends when I go to bed at night. And his point was that there are so many things that we still have in our world today that are a legacy of the Romans. From Roman law, and so many concepts coming from Latin in legal professions, and the Latin languages obviously, and the Christian church in the Catholic and Orthodox varieties, and our ways of building cities, the urban grid, and our way of building buildings at all, our calendar, our so many ways of looking at the world originated in Rome in this way, because they built this huge integrated empire where when one idea appeared somewhere, it could rapidly appear elsewhere as well. So while they might not have been as innovative as the Athenians, if anyone anywhere stumbled onto a new idea, it rapidly traveled over all the roads that led to Rome and the Mediterranean, which was in effect a Roman lake. Another culture that learned from the Romans and actually considered itself the ancestors of Rome. I'm not thinking of Eastern Rome, I'm thinking of the Abbasid Caliphate here in Baghdad, the capital that they built in the late 8th century. This was a new empire that integrated through commerce and one system of law the whole region from northern Africa all the way over the Middle East, all the way to Central Asia and to Afghanistan. and thereby creating lots of prosperity, becoming the richest civilization on the planet some 1,200 years ago, but also the most scientifically curious and the most technologically innovative civilization of its time. Because it was, and this is in stark contrast to many of the states that are now in that region, intellectually tolerant. They invited everybody, of every faith and of every region, to come to Baghdad and to other cities and to tell them what they have seen, because they had the idea that to block out facts and science is to block out the kingdom of God. So they could make use of more people's ideas and science and build something on top of that. That's, by the way, why Baghdad looked like that, at least in the recreations that we have. It's built as a perfect circle in honor of the caliph's favorite geometrician, Euclid. You might have other favorite geometricians, but this was his, and this was his way of honoring a thriving commercial city full of shops and of bookshops. We don't have to go further than the letter A to see how much of intellectual debt we have to that Arab civilization. We have algebra, we've got algorithm, we have got arithmetics, all Arab words, and by the way, speaking of Arab numbers, is also something we got from there, which made it easier to do calculations and arithmetics. Ironically, we also have alcohol from Arabic. But then, obviously, we became the experts when it comes to that. And that's what culture is about. It's about learning and adapting what the discoveries of other civilizations. The only competitor in those days to the Abbasid Caliphate was on the other side of the globe, on the other side of the Silk Road, and that was China. You know, Karl Marx, founder of socialism, he claimed that the very thing that ushered in the rule of the bourgeoisie were three novel innovations. It was the magnetic compass, it was gunpowder, and it was the printing press. But of course, they weren't novel at all. The Chinese had it all 1,000 years ago. And they were remarkably innovative during the Song dynasty in the 11th, 12th, and 13th century. That was the moment when they really thrived. And what was going on back then was that they had a new dynasty that created stability, civilian control of the armies and the warlords, and then established a system of more of rule of law than they had had under other dynasties. And this meant that they provided farmers with property rights, so that farmers could begin to experiment with new crops. So old luxury crops like tea and rice that normal Chinese had never tasted, they suddenly became the cheap consumer goods because these farmers started to experiment and innovate. And with the help of paper money, they created a commercialized economy, an agricultural revolution that led to urbanization, lots of people moving to cities, and those cities exploded in a more commercialized trade society. And they came up with novelties, new textile machines, a production of iron and steel that Europe wouldn't surpass in total until the 18th century, probably. Some economic historians claim that the Chinese back then, in the 13th century, were close to unleashing an industrial revolution, 500 years before the British did. And some intellectual historians claim that they were even close to unleashing, with novel philosophical and cultural ideas, a renaissance, a long time before the Italians came up with the same idea. But to get to a real renaissance, we have to go to the Renaissance. And that is our fifth culture. Renaissance Italy, 14th, 15th century. What's happened there is that they are beginning to think that it's strange that we haven't been able to accomplish as much as our ancestors did during the Roman Empire, Athenian Republic. So why is that? What can we do? And then they heard about what was going on in China. Marco Polo venturing out there, telling them that they have extraordinary wealth, new materials, bigger ships, they have more trade. So shouldn't we be able to do something like that back home? They were always trading the North Italian merchant cities with the Arab cities. Even though that wasn't always popular with the Pope, they kept doing it because, as the saying went back then in Venice and Florence, was that trade should be free all the way to the gates of hell, which I think is a great free trade slogan, should be a T-shirt in these days of trade wars around the world. Because what they picked up was not just more wealth than others. They also picked up new ideas, new ways of, new financial innovations, and Arabic numerals that make double entry bookkeeping possible, and with the Medici banks and financial revolutions, they also made more trade and discoveries possible, and also engaged in conspicuous consumption in the arts. Because if you have social mobility, it's not enough just to talk about your ancestors, you have to prove yourself and show what you are about. And one way of doing that is to ask Michelangelo to do a sculpture for you, or Leonardo da Vinci to make a portrait. So the Renaissance then gives us many of those extraordinary masterpieces. But obviously the Renaissance is cut short by the Italian War, by religious conflict, by the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, and most of Europe ends up in major, disastrous wars. The one part of Europe that makes it out and becomes a link between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment is the Dutch Republic. In the 16th century, a part of the Spanish Habsburg Empire, and they are learning from the Spanish about ideals, about individual rights and free markets from the school of Salamanca, and they are using those ideas to set themselves free from Spain during an 80-year-long war against the Habsburg dynasty. And the most remarkable thing is that nobody expects them to win, right? Because they have nothing. They don't have a monarchy, no strong aristocracy. They don't even have land on which to stand and grow crops. But that forces them to become more innovative and to open their economies and their universities to refugees from everywhere else. So they get people with skills, with new financial knowledge, with and some of the greatest scholars that will unleash the Enlightenment, like Spinoza, Descartes, and John Locke. None of them from the Netherlands, but all of them ending up there, having fled from Spinoza's family from Portugal, Descartes from France, John Locke from England, because at this point in time, the Dutch Republic is most open to new ideas, and they managed to come out of the war being the richest economy on the planet and with the biggest empire around the world. And a remarkable golden era with Rembrandt, Vermeer, artists like that. And they also do something that's somewhat forgotten. The greatest thing the Dutch ever did was to invade England in 1688, because they constantly felt threatened by England and France, worried about the next war. So they thought the one thing we can do to protect ourselves is, in 1688, to try to invade our arch enemy, England, and try to transplant our own ideals into that bigger body politic. And they succeed. William of Orange, not just an invader, but also invited by parts of the British Parliament who wants his help against the Stuart monarchs. And it ends up being a quick and fairly successful revolution, rapidly rebranded as the Glorious Revolution by the English, saying that this is the time when we got back our ancient rights against our king. And obviously it's more complex than that. But the interesting thing is that this is the start of the Anglo sphere, which I think is kind of the era that we still live in, or at least lived in until quite recently. Because now those Dutch ideals that were the school of Salamanca ideas in Spain about restraining the rights of executive government power, of free markets, of property rights, and of trade, they now become British ideals. And when the British lose their North American colonies, they become American ideals. And then, in that vast continental power, which, with a remarkable set of entrepreneurial talents and innovative capacities, they become the mightiest power on the planet, and after the Second World War, building a world order with the help of other democracies around the world that made the world safe for, I would argue, Dutch and Salamanca ideals. And that's the world we're still in, hopefully, about trying to, for all its perfections, it was a world order in which we tried to solve conflicts through negotiations rather than gunboats, with trade that was free, communication that was free, open seas, that made it possible for more countries than ever before to not constantly look around the shoulder to see whether their neighbors were going to attack them, and instead focus their energies on creating more knowledge, more capacity, more wealth. And that's why we're in the first golden era that's not just regional by nature, but for the first time, it is global. For the first time, we've seen effects throughout the world. And in these past 200 years, we've probably reduced extreme poverty from almost 90% of the world population to less than 10% today. We've increased life expectancy from some 30 years back then to 74 years today. This is a remarkable golden age, if we can keep it. So our ancestors would definitely look at this and say that this is quite extraordinary compared to anything that we could achieve. So what is going on here? What have we seen? If we just look at these 7 golden ages, and if my editor had been more generous, I would have included more civilizations. But only these 7 shows us that we can't explain golden ages with geography, because the center of progress keeps changing, keeps moving around the world throughout history. We can't explain it with religion, because we've been looking at pagans and Catholics and Calvinists and Muslims and Confucians and Anglicans and seculars. So it's more about how they held those ideals. Did they do it in those faiths? Did they do it in a way that built an orthodoxy and you didn't accept any kind of discovery or innovation from elsewhere? Or did you do it in a way that made it possible to keep on learning, keep on growing? Because that's the key to building golden ages. The 2 keys, the 2 secrets, if you want to build your own golden age in your city, in your country, in your organization, your business, or even in your private life, I think there are 2 secrets, and that's imitation and innovation. You need both of them. First of all, looking at imitation, you know how hard it is to come up with a brand new idea that no one has ever thought about before? I try to do it all the time, but it's hard. It's much easier if you listen to the ideas of others and then you try to combine them in new ways. And that's what all these civilizations did. They were created at the crossroads between other civilizations. They were always learning. Merchant cultures that picked up new, not just goods and services, but new ideas, new methods from other places. Like the Athenians, not just between the Phoenicians and the Egyptians, but also neighboring another 1,000 Greek city-states. So they could always compare what they were doing and learn from the best. Obviously, they made a lot of war as well, but it made it possible for them to pick up new ideas, compare what they were doing to what others were doing. Or like the Romans did, up in the right corner, it's Emperor Claudius' text, when he tried to convince the Senate that now, after having fought the Gauls for 100 years, let's turn them into citizens, because that's the way to acquire talent and brains and hard work from those peoples. So the Romans were obviously brutal conquerors, but so were everyone back in those days. What made the Romans successful conquerors were that they were strategically tolerant. They constantly picked up new ideas from new places. So they knew that you can't rule a huge empire from one city. You have to give the provinces power, and you have to allow them to keep their property, their gods, their ideas. And then we'll pick up the best ideas and people from those places. Tolerance was not something that they engaged in because they were kind. They weren't. They truly enjoyed brutal conquest. But they did it because tolerance was a weapon. Diversity was a strength, literally. They picked up their ways of organizing their legions from the Etruscans. They picked up their shields from the Samnites. They picked up their Spanish swords from, well, the Spanish. The stabbing swords. They built an entire navy by looking at a shipwreck from Carthage. They even experimented with war elephants when Hannibal had attacked them with war elephants coming over the Alps. So they constantly learned from others, imitated, and so they became more powerful. Or in the bottom right, you can see that's supposed to be Hugo Grotius, the great Dutch legal thinker, natural rights theoretician, creator of international law, according to most textbooks. But as you can see, he got his ideas from Vitoria, from Suarez, and from other Spanish Dominican thinkers who had got some of their best ideas from Thomas of Aquinas, who got some of his best ideas from Averroes in Muslim Spain, who got his best ideas from Aristotle. So we are constantly learning, picking up the best ideas and removing the bad ones, and then constantly moving on. That's the first step to building success. The other one is innovation. Because once you have those new ingredients, you have to come up with new, better dishes. And that's hard. That's hard work as well. As Joel Mokyr, the economic historian who recently won the Nobel Prize in Economics, put it, every act of innovation is an act of rebellion against vested interests and common wisdom. Which means that if vested interests and common wisdom have veto power in a society, they will shut things down. Nothing much will happen. Why would a church that has built its power on one specific interpretation of nature accept new discoveries? Why would a guild system or a monopoly or a trade union that has built its economic power on particular production methods accept new experiments? Well, that's why we need freedom. That's why we need rule of law that restricts the government from picking winners, deciding who will get what, and instead establish systems where surprises are acceptable, where people are allowed to use their own property, their own work, in investing in new strange ideas and reap the rewards if they are successful. And that's what the Golden Ages did. This is a reason why Golden Ages are quite rare, because this is hard work. But some did, like in Athens, accepting freedom of speech, allowing people to speak their minds and being able to participate in new debates. Or like the steam engine that had existed elsewhere in Europe, but had been blocked by guilds, by traditional economic restrictions, but were allowed to be used and perfected in Britain and then unleashing the Industrial Revolution. Or here we've got two different ships We've got the greatest Chinese ship under Hongzhi in the 14th century with the biggest tribute ships. They had a huge armada that could have discovered the world. And then the tiny ship over there, that's Santa Maria. That's Columbus' ship with which he discovered America. But the Chinese didn't discover the world. They didn't become rulers of the seas. Because in an authoritarian system, you'd better be lucky and get an emperor that's interested in progress and innovation. But in the long run, it's difficult to be successful with every new emperor. Eventually, they got a Ming emperor who just said, no, we want stability. So we will stop these commercial experiments, we will ban international trade, and we will tie the farmers to their land and force them to cultivate the same crops that they've always done. And the Chinese got stability, but they also got 500 years of stagnation. Whereas Europe was different. Here, when a crazy eccentric like Columbus had a new idea, let's go in the other direction. He could go to different counts in Italy to try to raise funds, and he was rejected. He could go to England, being rejected, going to France, was rejected, going to Portugal, and he was rejected, and then eventually to Isabel and Ferdinand, and he got his sponsorship, and then the rest is history. That's the difference. More decentralized systems make it possible for those rebellious acts of innovation to triumph compared to centralized systems. Then, if you have imitation and innovation, you might, if you're lucky, reach the next step. And that is building a culture of possibility, a culture of optimism. It's not all about institutions, it's about the very perception that change is possible, improvement and progress is possible. You need that, because innovation is hard. It is tricky. When we've found ways that work, we stick to that, usually. So we need those eccentrics. I always include nowadays a picture of the flying shuttle that made weaving much more productive during the Industrial Revolution, because it always puzzles technology historians. Why? Because it seems so simple. It didn't require any specific materials. It didn't require any specialized knowledge. As one historian puts it, every weaver throughout history should have been able to come up with a flying shuttle just through a process of trial and error. But for 5,000 years, nobody did. For 5,000 years. And that tells me that we're not that very innovative. We have to see other people around us who experiment and innovate and succeed and become fabulously wealthy and become role models. And that might encourage us to do the same thing. So it took the Industrial Revolution with experiments in steam engines and horseshoes and in hot air balloons to get weavers to think, oh, I might be able to improve this thing as well. Or the Renaissance, the great artists back then. You needed someone like Giotto of Florence who came up with new perspectives and depth in art. And then Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo could keep on perfecting those techniques. And you need some competition and rivalry as well. You know, Leonardo and Michelangelo, they didn't like one another. Michelangelo complained that Leonardo was a great procrastinator who never finished his great works, whereas Leonardo said, oh, but your muscular, strange figures, they don't look like muscle men, it looks like sacks of walnuts. And I think they both had a point, but more importantly, that very rivalry spurred them to achieve more. So this, I think, is a reason why we often have clusters in history. You know, philosophers in Athens and painters and in Florence and tech guys in Silicon Valley, classical music in Vienna and so on and so on. Because you have to look at those role models, someone to learn from, to get inspired from, and to cooperate with and to compete with. That's a culture of optimism, and that creates a golden age. Which brings us to the most depressing question there is. If it's so great, if it's so magnificent, why do these cultures all eventually decline and fall? And that's complicated. One German historian in 1984 tried to collect all the reasons that had been mentioned for the fall of Rome. He ended up with a list of 210 different reasons. So it's somewhat over-explained. So from barbarian invasions to inflation and lead poisoning to sadness and gout, apparently. So many factors can play a role in the decline and fall. But I go with the historian Somerville, who pointed out that cultures don't die of old age, they die of murder or of suicide. So either they're killed from the outside, and that could be invasions, or it could be natural disasters, and that sometimes happens. At the same time, you can bounce back from such disasters. You can beat back the invaders, you can rebuild cities, the survivors after a huge pandemic can keep going. However, it's much more difficult to bounce back from suicide if you've decided that you've given up. And that's something we see throughout history as well, that sometimes cultures lose their cultural self-confidence. They lose that spark, that culture of optimism that kept them going. And instead, they begin to try to protect the old ways, stifle innovation, and in that case, their pessimism becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think that there are two specific psychological seeds of decline that's always present in every civilization, but at times it might ruin it completely. The first one is complacency, being too comfortable. Once you've managed to get something done, you stick to it. Once you have this wealth, you're comfortable, you're happy with it. You think more about how to consume the results than about how to create more of it in the long run. And then you forget the institutions, the novelties that are needed to regenerate and keep it going. So often you build layers of special interests that protect the old systems, layers of regulations, and you try to live beyond your means. So traditionally you debase the coinage, put bad metal into the gold and silver, and you raise debts that you're not able to repay in the long run. This is the sort of death by comfort that sometimes happens, and then other hungrier cultures in the vicinity might be able to outcompete you completely. The other tendency is panic and fear, which seems like the opposite, right? You're comfortable or you're terrified, but they both make you forget why you got here, the institutions and the hard work that it took to get here. Because when we end up in fear and panic, and that sometimes happens when you face all those horrible sort of the invaders, the pandemics, the natural disasters. Something that often happens is that societies panic and just think, oh, let's hand power to one big leader, one strong man, to the big government just to protect us. Let's skip all this intellectual debate and let's just move on with it. And let's find scapegoats like Socrates and sentence him to death because we don't want troublemakers anymore. And then that also becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy, because while the world is a dangerous place and it is scary out there, what's needed to solve and deal with those problems is not just to escape from it all and try to hide from it, it's to be more innovative, to learn more, to come up with better ideas on how to innovate our ways around it. But when you panic, you're not thinking clearly, you're not learning from history, you're not paying attention. And that's why I would like to end with the real lesson of history. And this comes from Thucydides, 2,300 years ago, the ancient Greek historian, who pointed out that there are two different mentalities in the world. It's the Athenian, constantly venturing out abroad, traveling to far distant places to try to pick up new ideas and acquire new methods and wealth. And it's the Spartan, staying at home to try to protect what he already has. And both of these mentalities can play a valuable role at times, but broadly speaking, you have to be an Athenian if you want to build a golden age. You have to learn more, you have to be more adaptive and more innovative. And I think Thucydides' point is that every culture, every civilization has a little bit of the Athenian and the Spartan within. And so do we all. We have them over here, and they appear at different times. So we are Athenian and we are Spartan, but we decide who we let out. Thank you. Yeah, that's how you do it. That's more dignified, the entrance there.
I'm not as sporty as you, so today's the way. In the end, your book is about sports. Huh?
Yeah, so, that's right.
Okay, I'm going to say in Spanish. Just, vamos a tener un diálogo ahora en...
We are now going to talk in English, and afterwards we'll have time for questions. The questions are already arriving, so I switch to English.
I have a question which is almost a methodological question, right? You were speaking here of 7 civilizations. You speak about 7 civilizations in your book. Why these cases and not other cases? I know you touched upon this when you were talking about your editor, etc. But why focusing on these specific civilizations? Are we missing anything by not including other cases?
Yeah, that's a good question, and another way of phrasing it is, why is Spain not there? And apologies, had the book been longer, had the editor been more generous, Spain would have been there. However, so first of all, this is my methodology. I actually talked to historians and economic historians about their idea of a golden age, where you have these massive amounts of innovations in different sectors at the same time. And I got different answers from different people, but these 7 were on everybody's list. So these were the ones I had to deal with, I thought. So that's one reason why I did that. But I'd be happy to write a sequel with more civilizations. But it's also interesting with Spain, for example, making guest appearances in so many of these, well, in all of these cultures, because you can see how the School of Salamanca has been absolutely essential when it comes to our concepts of law, of economic freedom, individual rights, how the La Casas and the debates about the rights of the Indians, that in 1550 in Valladolid, how do I pronounce it? Something like that, instituted by the Spanish government. That was the first time we started talking about human rights for real, and it's there. And obviously with the adventurers, Spain built the first era of globalization together with the Portuguese. However, this does not make a civilization. It's guest appearances here and there, and that's my point when I write this book. It's not sort of secluded cultures here and there. It's cultures constantly in dialogue with one another, learning from and picking up the best bits and pieces from other places. And the thing specifically with Spain that made it difficult to introduce it here is that while there were amazing intellectual and artistic creativity during the Spanish Golden Era, it was hard to see the same thing in the economy, throughout the economy, how it raised living standards for people more broadly. So in that case, it was more difficult to turn that into one single chapter.
Mm-hmm. I was not thinking of Spanish civilization, whatever, per se. I was thinking Ottoman, maybe, the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, that's right. And
so
some of the... And India, sort of Indus Valley civilizations, there are many others that could have been there, for sure.
Your book identifies common factors in the rise and fall of these 7 golden ages, right? For instance, I think one big concept here is the openness, right? So that you have discussed in previous books as well, right? Openness to trade, openness to people, to ideas. So I have a question that is almost like a double question, right? What lessons can we draw here to address current global challenges you were discussing a little bit, and specifically, and this is almost unavoidable, right? As we speak, bombs are raining all over the Middle East, right? Any specific lessons or findings in your book that are suitable for this situation? Anything useful to solve this crisis? However we define crisis, everything is very blurry, still we don't know what's going to happen, etc. Right? So how would you apply your findings there? It's very specific. Very specific.
I was asked this again and again in this past few days. What's the closest parallel to what we're living through right now, and especially when it comes to the Middle East? And the good thing about writing about 2,500 years of history is that there's always one parallel somewhere. I would say the closest we get to the Middle East is Europe in the 16th and 17th century, with many different authoritarian, mostly authoritarian states fighting over religion, or at least that's what they claim to be fighting over endlessly, constantly, and worried about their neighbors and their rivals. And that's worrying because it took a long time for Europe to get out of it. On the other hand, one result was the birth of the Enlightenment and saying that, let's stop doing this, right? Let's stop trying to enforce our ideas on others and live and let live. And we got the Enlightenment and the modern world. Not certain that that's going to happen right now. And the difference right now is that we also have a superior power trying to intervene from abroad. And I couldn't be more happier than if this ended with peace and freedom for the Iranian people. And actually, Iran is in the epilogue, where I'm saying that this could be one of the great golden ages in the future if they are ever liberated, because Iranians are tremendously successful everywhere in the world, but in Iran. So there's something about that. However, wars are messy, and we have no idea how this is going to end. It might end in new dictatorship, more chaos. It could mean that the whole country falls apart completely. That's also something that we learn from history. Good intentions, if that's what it is not enough, because the proof is in the pudding. So, but I would add this, something important related to world orders is that the traditional American world order is falling apart as we speak. And no matter what happens in this war, this is suddenly a period where we've begun to abandon the rules-based order and instead engage in more of a might is right system. And while toppling dictators is one thing, threatening your allies in NATO, in Canada and Denmark and taking Greenland, that's exactly how Athens began to fall apart as a great power when they run the Delian League, which was kind of the NATO of its day. Because Athens was seen as a reliable partner, so everybody wanted to cooperate. But the moment when Athens got military superiority, they became tempted to use it, even against their own member states, and even attack them to acquire their mineral resources, their silver mines, and so on. And that was the moment when other Greek city-states began to see that, oh, look, we might have to look for new friends over here. And that was not peak Athens, that was the beginning of their long decline.
Speaking about things falling apart, many of the civilizations that you study in your book collapse when they stop being open, when they become closed or inward-looking. You gave us some examples in your talk. To what extent do, on the one hand, internal social, political, economic dynamics, and on the other hand, external pressure or constraints, if you want, explain this decline? I mean, is one more decisive than the other? Both play the same role?
Yeah.
Internal and external.
Both played an incredibly important role historically, and often in an interaction. Often some kind of foreign threat that makes you more of a Spartan, because suddenly the world is dangerous, so why not hide from that world, and then you build. You know, it's like the individual fight or flight instinct. When we see a predator or a lion, if you've done that recently, we want to flee or fight. And it's the same thing with societies. We want to sort of fight or build walls against the rest of the world. I think that's the strongest temptation. But then obviously there's also this slow, ongoing accumulation of special interests that are very happy with where they are right now. They've built their political or economic power on a particular system, and then they're not happy with novelty, threatening that, and that's one reason that even very stable societies, after a while, Mansur Olson wrote a great book about this, The Economist, was it The Rise and Decline of Nations, something like that, which pointed out that eventually you accumulate so many special interests and regulations that it's hard to be open to new ideas, new technologies, new business models. And so it could happen from a slow internal process as well.
If there's one, you were mentioned before, imitation and innovation, but I would like to talk a little bit about openness as well, right? If there's one single broad factor that explains why civilizations thrive and flourish, it's openness, right? Your book. However, it seems that nowadays we're not going in that direction. Countries are less and less open, it seems, right? So countries try to close borders. They prevent ideas from spreading, especially internally, ideas coming from abroad, prevent people from entering countries, prevent goods and services from flowing freely. Does all of this point to a collapse, to use your own words, of our civilization in the near future, you think? And by the way, which civilization will be that is collapsing? Is the West or is European? What is that?
Yeah, how encouraging. So I think that I think we've all become more Spartan in recent years because we've had a pretty bad run with sort of endless wars, geopolitical strife, the pandemic, Putin. The world seems like a dangerous place, and it seems like a reasonable solution is just to shut the world out, right? So and some build a political career on this. and you know, that's what Trump said. I'll protect you against a dangerous world. It's crazy out there, but I'll fix it and I'll build those walls and I'll impose tariffs on everybody else. So we do have that tendency, and it exists everywhere. Unfortunately, it's self-defeating because it only means that you deny yourself access to the best technologies and the best competition and the best people from other places. So it is a dangerous temptation, but it will be very powerful here in the longer run. However, I would point out that you remember America did this in 1930 as well. They imposed tariffs on the rest of the world. And then we all imposed our own tariffs. We didn't do that this time around. That's the difference. So it seems like we're learning something from history, that a trade war is a strange war where we take turns punching ourselves in the face. And we have it seems like we've decided that, okay, let the Americans punch themselves in the face and we'll try to avoid it. We have big sort of swing states like Brazil and India who have been engaging in more trade deals recently, and the European Union with the Mercosur agreement, the Indian agreement. It seems like we realize that, you know, the world is big and most new ideas and technologies will appear elsewhere. And if we're not open to them, somebody else will use them and they will be the next winners. Which brings us to the idea, the question, which one will fall first? And good question, difficult question, because it's all down to choices. It's down to the battle of ideas. This is not set in stone by any stretch. So it's about our policies and what we decide to do. It's been very there's a whole genre of thinkers and pundits who say that Europe is over and that sort of we're on decline. And sure, there are some signs we're old and we have a lot of wealth to protect. We're more fearful about what to lose. On the other hand, it seems like we have managed with a couple of amazing things. We've gone through the Euro crisis, the pandemic, and Putin's invasion of Ukraine and a whole energy system that has been changed. And we're actually still standing and adjusted for purchasing power parity. Europe as a whole has grown almost as fast as America since the turn of the millennium. And that's mostly because we have the Central and Eastern European economies that have been integrated into Europe. That's a remarkable achievement, and I think there's still so much potential in there. And I think perhaps this crisis is the very thing that makes us realize that there are some things we have to do when it comes to deregulation, when it comes to deepening the internal market to actually proceed. So I'm not giving up on Europe. I'm a little bit more worried about America right now.
Mm-hmm. We'll go back to that. But so, if you, I mean, this is a hard exercise, right? But if you had to choose one policy area, just for lack of a better term, to work on in order to help our societies thrive, for instance, trade or education or institutions of governance, anything that you mentioned, or maybe something different, some kind of normative or cultural change or something like that. Yeah. Which area has the greatest potential to accomplish this goal of like helping our societies thrive? You can only choose one.
Yeah. In that case, then I will cheat by having a macro policy, which is pooling resources and knowledge and capital. Referring back to the European question, we're 500 million people. But we don't have a functioning internal market because the capital market and the service market is closed down by national regulations and different standards of regulation. If we could just get that going, then we'd have 500 million people who, with their knowledge, with their entrepreneurial capacity, will have a new Roman Empire where ideas that appear somewhere on the continent will rapidly be used elsewhere. We will pool capital so that young European entrepreneurs don't have to go to America to fund their businesses. And we'll have huge new service companies that will appear because with a push of a button, they'll have access to the entire European market. That's the one macro policy that I would push for to actually make Europe a reality.
Right. It's not really cheating. I think it's okay.
Thank you.
As one.
Because, you know, the good news is that I meet so many talented young European entrepreneurs. The bad news is that I meet most of them in California. And it's not because they dislike Europe. They love it here. But that's where the capital is. But we have that capital if we could only pool it.
Yeah, it's there. I would like to address something. I don't know how much you touch upon this in your book. How to explain this? The concept of, or the idea of denial. And why do I mean by that? You were mentioning before in your talk this thing of optimism, right? It's not just, you know, the inventors or the institutions. You were saying it's just kind of a state of mind, if you want, like collective or something like that. What are we as citizens? Not as inventors, not as anything else, like people who just go about with our lives in daily life. Are we realistic when it comes to identify social, if you want, civilizational problems and their solutions? So what is the role that we have to have as citizens, right? It became almost a truism, a stereotype, what the former president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, said famously once, we know what to do, but we don't know how to get reelected if we do it, right? So this is just one of the many examples, right? So are we, I don't know if to say responsible or we see clearly as citizens the problems that are there and how to fix them?
No, we don't. But few do. I mean, few people spend their time thinking about institutions and public policy and fiscal responsibility, because we only see the sort of the other side of the sausage machine in a way, rather than the few people are in the privileged position, but also kind of depressing position of thinking of the whole sausage-making process involved in there. So we're not definitely not realistic. But the bigger problem is that many who are involved and who should know better, they are in denial about these things. And this is a clear traditional sign of a decline and fall of a society. When we begin, we live beyond our expenses. We think more about the consumption than of the production. We don't want to go through the hassle of creative destruction, which is really what we need to come up with new and better business models, and then we have to let the old ones go. If you're too comfortable, you don't want to pay that price to get it done. And that's really, I think, a duty of good leadership, to talk seriously in an adult way about those challenges, about what we can and what we cannot do, that there are no perfect solutions, only trade-offs, and that there are some prices that we're going to have to pay for a better result tomorrow. And no, right now we are in denial over that, and that's a shame.
And I was also thinking of maybe not just your metaphor of the sausage machine is very clear, right? Because it's you can see the image, right? But before we were chatting a little bit about this this experience that I had in your home country in Sweden when I was a visiting professor there. I was living in Lund. Lund, as you know, is a university city. It's not too diverse in that sense, but I was living in Malmo, which is very, very close, right? And Malmo is a whole different universe, right? It's very, very, especially after the huge migration in the 2010, after war in Syria, et cetera, right? Yeah. And I saw there things that are like straight from a Hollywood movie, right? So of shootings and dead people and things like that. And when I went to work the next day after seeing all these things to Lund, and I was talking to my colleagues at the university, they were telling me that I was inventing this. So no, you haven't seen this, or if you have seen it, you don't understand. You're not Swedish, right? And what I was trying to say is like, well, I saw that with my own eyes, and I have some fair knowledge of what how the country is run, et cetera, right? So I mean that, right? So sometimes don't we have these kind of mindsets or ideas or prejudice or ideologies that prevent us from seeing reality and having an honest conversation on social issues or social problems, like consequences, good and bad, of migration, for instance, right? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we do live in different realities, even though it might just be a few blocks away from each other. And actually, that dialogue, I mean, I've lived in Malmö for 5 years, and that kind of dialogue could have been appearing between people in different parts of the city as well.
Right.
So I think that it's so difficult to rise above your local everyday experience. And for obvious reasons, we are where we are. And then we get most of the information about what is going on in the world through a very distorted lens of media and social media. And that really doesn't help us to understand what is going on in other places. So I think that's a good point, and it's well taken. That's one reason why we need more communication. We need more dialogue. We need to be open to the experiences of other people who have seen other things rather than thinking they invented it or saw it in a Hollywood movie.
Yep. Okay, my last question, because we have lots of questions from the audience. You mentioned in your talk, we live in ours is a remarkable golden age, if I'm quoting properly. But if we can keep it, this is what you said, right? So why would we not keep it? Okay, so why are the obstacles that you see to keep? I mean, we could be talking for hours about this, to pick a few of them that you see as an obstacle to keep our golden age, our current golden age?
Yeah. First of all, let me be a little bit hopeful. I think that this golden age we're in right now is different from all the previous ones because they were all regional by nature. When West Rome fell, that was the end of it. I mean, people lost the ability to build in concrete, and they lost the knowledge about so many different trades. They had to be relearned 500 years later, rediscovered. They lost the ability to build oxygen-tight containers, so they had to drink sour wine for several hundred years. If that's not the end of the civilization, I don't know what is. The difference this time around is that even if Spain or Sweden or America were to disappear, all that knowledge, all the technological achievements of our countries would not disappear because we live in a global civilization. Not when it comes to our values, not when it comes to our policies, but when it comes to state of knowledge, because we can instantly communicate with everybody else. And that brings me hope, I must say, for humanity as a whole, that even if we fail miserably in certain places, as long as some places stay creative, we can learn from them and pick up their best ideas as long as we stay open to them. So that's a reason why I don't think that, I mean, barring a nuclear apocalypse or something like that, I don't think we will lose this entire civilization now. But however, that's not great comfort for the place that will fail in the shorter run. And how might that happen? What are the tendencies? Well, I think that it comes with this loss of cultural self-confidence, this loss of excitement over new technologies and new businesses and new solutions to old problems. When we just become fearful of it, we won't see new generations entering into them. They won't get the capital and the cultural approval when they do. And that's the beginning of at least a slower decline and some sort of decline once that happens. So to me, it's incredibly important to keep that sort of the spirit of excitement over the next step. I even think it's a duty to be a bit optimistic, even when things seem a little bit scary, because I think pessimism might be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then if you combine that pessimism with layers of regulations that makes it harder and harder to test new things, if you then, on top of that, have a situation where you build up huge debts, which are increasingly difficult to repay, which means that you're in the hands of the international markets, then a slow decline might turn into a quick decline. You know, that's the Hemingway's response to how did you go bankrupt? Well, in two ways. First gradually, and then suddenly.
That's great. I think what you were describing before, we can call it like a reservoir of hope or something like that. I want to be as optimistic as you with this. Okay.
Oh, thank you.
I
think Karl Popper said that in his last lecture, or his last interview. We have a duty to be optimists. I know it's not easy every morning when we wake up, but if we become pessimists, we give up. You have to think that there's a way out. Not complacent optimists, but sort of we have it within our hands.
Okay, I'll have some questions for the audience. Someone who read in detail your book. I'll read this as I receive it in English. From your point of view, are Europe and the United States currently dominated by the Athenian or the Spartan mentality? There's another question here, which is, furthermore, are complacency and panic two things that are predominant? If so, how do you see people overcoming them?
Yeah, right now I would say that there's a lot of Spartans right now in Europe and America, but we do also have a lot of Athenians, and most of us are sort of a combination of them both. I think that in America and some of the leadership in Europe is quite sort of Spartan, thinking that the solution is to just protect and freeze things into place and control things. At the same time, we have amazingly creative entrepreneurial sectors and businesses that keep innovating themselves around all those obstacles. So both things are there, and I keep coming back to the fact that we've had 25 horrible years of geopolitical disasters and wars, pandemics, financial crashes, and these 25 years have been the best 25 years in human history. If you look at real living standards, the decline of poverty, the decline of infant mortality, and so on. And that's because while some of our politicians are very Spartan, entrepreneurs and innovators are incredibly Athenian and constantly adapt to those problems. So it's a mixed picture, mixed bag. So the second question was...
It was about panic and...
yes.
For our complacency and panic, two things that are predominant, and how to overcome them.
Sometimes we move swiftly from being too comfortable to being too fearful. And so you can go through the day and being complacent and then suddenly panic. And I think they could be two sides of the same coin. Because if your belief that, oh, it's great, it's comfortable, I take it for granted, is not really based on a sound analysis of where you are and what brought you here, then it might disappear just as quickly the moment you face any kind of obstacle. So what's the solution to this? Well, obviously I'm biased, but I think we have to learn from history. But I also think that we have those better angels within ourselves, and to constantly remind ourselves that we have to think about how we got here. What is the process? Which ones are the institutions that made our kinds of societies possible? Why are some growing and why aren't others doing it in the same way? So it takes an intellectual effort, and that's hard work, but that's why we do, right? We constantly nag about those things, about those institutions, and then when we panic, when we're fearful, try to remind ourselves to count to 10 and to realize one important thing. Social media is not reality. Because I think one reason why people panic is that we think that everybody's crazy everywhere, right? Isn't that the sense you get from the world? I do too. But then, extraordinarily, the same people tell me that except everyone that I meet all day long, because they are sane, normal people, good, hard-working people who solve problems. There's a disconnect there in a strange way. We can't all be surrounded by normal people, and yet everybody is crazy. So it tells you that we have a distorted lens that we're looking through the world. And that's obviously that we, somewhere in our human nature, we're attracted to drama, we're attracted to shocking things happening around the world. And obviously some shocking things do happen. But it gives us a distorted sense of how crazy everybody else are. Please keep in mind that most people belong to the exhausted majority, just like you.
Okay, maybe we can do a couple more quickly. Okay, this one brings another dimension here. I think it's very interesting. What influence does the aging of the world's population, including China and the so-called third world, have on the evolution of essential ongoing innovation? So aging, demography, I think is very important.
It is problematic because we read from the data that it seems like taking those risks, creating those eccentric startups, it's somewhat related to age for obvious reasons. I mean, when we age, we're a little bit more comfortable with, and we know how to do certain things, and we stick to it. We need some young eccentrics who provoke us in the next generation and tell us that everything we've done is wrong. That's one of the ways in which we build growing societies. As we all age, I think there's a risk there that we will, I think we already see that in the data. We have fewer startups partly as a result of that. And I think there's partly a solution in AI, how artificial intelligence might help us to come up with new ideas and combine old ideas in new ways that might help us to stay creative a little bit longer, but I am a bit worried about that.
I have another one here that connects with Europe and America. How much can Europe really thrive with America on such decline?
On
Such decline, collapse, just going down, declining.
to cooperate with.
How much can Europe really thrive with America on such decline? So it seems like connecting both.
Oh, right, yes. You know, I think that Europe and America have been fantastic partners for 80 years. This sort of transatlantic relationship could be deepened in a common market as well, with free mobility and trade. It's a perfect fit, and we would be able to become more creative and dynamic, both of us. Right now, it seems like our Western partners aren't that interested in that relationship, and in that case, we have to, unfortunately, become a little bit more self-reliant, and especially when it comes to military defense, we should have done that a long time ago. It's frankly embarrassing that we aren't capable of handling our own military matters in that regard. So, but when we do that, that comes at a price, and that comes at a price of mutual decline if we shut ourselves off from each other in more ways. I hope it doesn't really get to that. I hope that we'll keep on meeting, sending scholars and businesses and funders across the Atlantic constantly, and keep this going, because I think it's a beautiful partnership, or at least it used to be.
Okay, I have so many questions on, and pretty much they revolve around the same thing. It seems that part of the audience is not buying your optimism regarding Europe. So I have questions here like, do you think Europe is bound to die out of complacency? Yeah. Did Europe get too comfortable? Are we witnessing the decline of Europe? All this is in real time. You already mentioned Europe. Yeah. So maybe you can finish off with this. Yeah. Maybe you can just trump again your idea for optimism in the case of Europe.
Yeah, I agree. I hear you, and I feel the same at times. Definitely. I think there is a risk as an aging continent that we spend more time worrying about what we might lose rather than what we might gain if we are more innovative, and that's dangerous. We've had a system of regulation in Brussels that are like, the journalist Alan Betty put it, it's like the bureaucrats there are like the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park. They react to movement. Anytime somebody moves, they attack and kill it. And that's one reason why we haven't seen as much innovation as we would have wanted to. However, it's still the best idea in history. Remember, this used to be a continent that tore itself to pieces the moment we got the chance. Now, since the Second World War, we've not just managed to keep the peace, we've even made it seem sort of impossible that we would ever go to sort of war against each other again. Because, like, why would we? It's like there's no point. Because the European Union is an amazing project in the way it combines imitation and innovation, the way in which it's possible for people, capital, businesses to move about, and at the same time having political diversity, so that we have different experiments, so that we can pick up best practice from different countries. It's a beautiful idea. This should be the next golden age. However, we've blocked many of those things through our regulatory system. And the fact that the service market and the capital market is sort of compartmentalized through national regulation. So it is a challenge. It's amazing that we've come this far despite the fact that we have all those problems and obstacles. But Europe, and this is something that we talked about before this event, Europe is good in times of crisis. That's when we really move forward, because we are comfortable. We are too comfortable. But the moment that we realize that there is an existential crisis, we start moving. And we've seen this again and again. We saw this during the Euro crisis, I think, and the tremendous bounce back of so many of previous crisis economies, including Spain, is one example. The way in which we've constantly, Samuel Johnson, the British writer, he always said that the prospect of being hanged in the morning focuses the mind tremendously. If you think there's a risk that you will be executed, you get to work. You can't afford to be complacent anymore. And I think that we are there right now, with the prospect that we might be abandoned by America, or even America might become a rival, and threatened by Putin and the rise of China. I think that's an existential moment. And I hear many better noises coming out of Brussels than I've seen in a long time. Much less about how to regulate water bottles and GDPR, and more talk about GDP and how to deregulate and get back to business again. And there are some serious efforts. The fact that after 25 years of negotiations, we managed to get the Mercosur trade deal and then the India trade deal going, it's a sign that it's serious this time around. And if we don't get it done there's no excuse for us anymore. Then I'll buy all that pessimism, I'm afraid. But this is the moment when we might do it. We've surprised the world before in bouncing back, and it could just happen again. Unfortunately, Samuel Johnson wrote that about a man who was actually sentenced to being executed in the morning, and he wrote a tremendous defense then of his case. It wasn't enough. He was hanged in the morning. So there is always that risk. We have to keep that in mind.
Okay. I've been told that we need to just finish now, so we're going to leave it here. Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting, and thank you. Gracias.
Thank you. Thanks for all the great questions.
Okay.